Hey, it's Adam. Welcome to Trust Native English. Have you ever heard people using phrasal verbs like looking forward to, or way up, or deal with? What are they talking about? These aren't like normal verbs. In fact, sometimes they literally make no sense at all. So how can you even begin to understand what these mean? Phrasal verbs are one of the most important and yet probably one of the most difficult areas for English students to learn, but they don't have to be. In fact, with the right mindset and techniques, you can really start to feel confident about using them. And we should be excited about using phrasal verbs because these are one of the few areas that can take your English from good to fluent to even sounding more native. And in this video, I'm going to share 7 steps to help you understand and even master phrasal verbs so you can feel confident using them in your conversations. So with this in mind, let's get stuck into those 7 steps. Okay, let's kick off these steps with what are phrasal verbs and why do we use them? Simply put, phrasal verbs are a combination of 2 or 3 words that together indicate an action, and we sometimes call these multi-word verbs. And when we add that second or third word, sometimes called particles, we completely transform the meaning of that verb. So for example, if I take the verb stand and add the preposition in, stand in, this now means to replace something, to substitute something. Or if we add 2 particles, up and for, to mean stand up for, this phrasal verb now means to defend somebody, a completely different meaning. So why do we use phrasal verbs? Well, it's not to make English harder, although it may feel that way sometimes. It's actually because phrasal verbs make English more conversational and even more informal. Although, make no mistake, we do still use them regularly in formal English and business English. Did you know that we've actually been using and shaping phrasal verbs for hundreds of years? And if you've ever watched an English series or film, I'm sure you've noticed that natives just love to use phrasal verbs. We use them all the time at every opportunity. In fact, they're a really important part of our language and our culture. Step number 2 is how do we construct a phrasal verb? How do we build them? And a phrasal verb consists of a verb plus 1 or 2 particles, which are prepositions or adverbs. For example, take the phrasal verb write down. Write down any questions you may have. Write is the verb, down is the particle. Write down any questions you may have. Or how about a 3-part phrasal verb with 2 particles? I'm looking forward to working with you. Looking forward to. This means to be excited about doing something in the future. And it's a great phrasal verb. This is one that you must know and use. I use it pretty much every day. It's something that we use for general conversation and even in formal letters or business emails. At the end, we'll typically say, I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Step 3 is about why people find phrasal verbs confusing. Firstly, there are thousands of them and they can differ from country to country. And while we have some phrasal verbs that have a more literal meaning, for example, the phrasal verb look for. Look for means to search for something. For example, she looked for a new job in a management position. This is a pretty logical, literal meaning. We also have idiomatic phrasal verbs, which at first glance aren't so easy to understand. Their meaning is not so obvious. For example, the team was fired up for the game. They were excited and enthusiastic. They were fired up. On its own, it's pretty hard to understand what this is talking about. And to make matters worse, phrasal verbs can have multiple meanings. So the same phrasal verb could have 2, 3, 4 different meanings. For example, take the phrasal verb going under. The ship is going under the water, meaning the ship is going beneath the surface. Pretty easy, it's a literal phrasal verb. Compare that to the business is going under, an idiomatic phrasal verb to mean that the business is failing. And finally, another reason why people find phrasal verbs confusing is often because they try to learn them through long random lists of phrasal verbs, which can be pretty overwhelming and confusing and of course hard to remember. In fact, this is such an important point that step 7 is going to be all about how to effectively learn and practice phrasal verbs, so make sure you stick around for that. Step number 4 is remember to change the grammatical form. We must remember to change the tense or form of the phrasal verb. You know, just because we have a preposition or an adverb attached to that verb, it doesn't mean we can ignore the tense or the form. So we could have, for example, past, present, future, continuous, perfect, even question or negative form. And we change the grammatical form via the verb or the auxiliary verb. For example, take the phrasal verb meet up, which basically means to meet. We could say, we will meet up, we met up, we have met up, we're meeting up, or have we met up to discuss your promotion? So always remember to adjust the grammatical form of your phrasal verbs. Step number 5 is about learning the difference between transitive and intransitive phrasal verbs. So we need to pay attention here. Transitive phrasal verbs require a direct object for them to make sense, a direct object that is acted upon by the verb. And to make this clearer, let's use an example. Let's take the phrasal verb drop off, which means to take something or someone to a place and leave it there. Now, we can't just say they dropped off. Something's missing here. We need to know, what is it that they dropped off? What's that object? So we would say something like this. They dropped off a package at the office. Or another example, let's use I'm looking forward to, which we saw earlier. This is another transitive phrasal verb that needs an object for it to make sense. I can't just say I'm looking forward to. There's something missing. Looking forward to what? I'm looking forward to meeting you next week. I'm looking forward to that new movie in the cinema. And intransitive phrasal verbs are phrasal verbs that do not need, in fact, cannot have a direct object. For example, the plane took off. Took off already implies the complete action, so we don't need an object for clarity or definition here. So to clarify, transitive phrasal verbs require that object to make sense. Intransitive phrasal verbs cannot have a direct object. Step 6 is to recognize that phrasal verbs can be separable or inseparable. And transitive phrasal verbs, which remember need a direct object we looked at a moment ago, they can be both separable and inseparable. Now, a separable transitive phrasal verb means that we can take the object and place it between the verb and the particle. For example, Simone made up a story. Or, if we separate it, Simone made the story up. And an important point to note here, if the object is a pronoun like it, he, she, him, or her, it must be placed between the verb and the particle. For example, they dropped her off at the airport. Not they dropped off her at the airport. Now, moving on to inseparable phrasal verbs, intransitive and some transitive phrasal verbs are what we call inseparable, where we cannot separate the verb from the particle. For example, I came across some old files in a drawer, but not I came some old files across in a drawer. This makes no sense. I came across some old files in a drawer. And if a transitive phrasal verb has two particles, like the example looking forward to, we cannot separate the verb from the particle. They must be together. So they are an inseparable transitive phrasal verb. And here's another example of an intransitive phrasal verb, which are always inseparable. The question, where did you grow up? I grew up in Hampshire, England. Where did you grow up means where were you raised as a child? Where did you become an adult? So how can you know when a phrasal verb is transitive, when it's intransitive and separable or not? Isn't it all a bit confusing? There are some dictionaries that will tell you if a phrasal verb is intransitive or transitive, but most won't. So what can you do? Well, my advice is to practice and expose yourself as much as possible to the language where you can actually see the phrasal verbs in action. This is how natives develop their intuition for phrasal verbs and how to use them. And it's how you can also develop that same intuition over time. And speaking of practice, that brings us on to our next and final step in this video. So finally, step 7 is how to effectively learn and practice phrasal verbs. Now, as you know, there are thousands of phrasal verbs in the English language, so trying to remember long lists of them can be pretty overwhelming and hard to remember, especially if those phrasal verbs aren't really applicable to you and you don't really use them. So it's much more effective to learn key phrasal verbs that are from a subject or area that you're interested in or that's useful to you, perhaps your area of work or your profession. That way you'll be learning much more targeted phrasal verbs that you can actually use, and that'll be more interesting and of course easier to remember because you can apply them. And through this process you'll start to develop that intuition that I spoke of a moment ago, where you'll start to feel how a phrasal verb works, how it can be used, if it's separable or if it requires an object to make sense. So where can you find these phrasal verbs? Well, you can find great phrasal verbs in ebooks, books, articles, even audiobooks, which I highly recommend, because as you start to engage more senses into your learning process, so you're seeing them and you're hearing them, you actually reinforce and strengthen that process. So you'll retain more of the phrasal verbs that you learn. And finally, guys, a really important point, remember that there are so many phrasal verbs that at some point you have to accept that this is not going to be a all-in-one process. You're not going to learn every phrasal verb in one go. It's a continual and gradual process of adding more phrasal verbs to your vocabulary. So take it easy on yourself. Okay, so as we've covered a lot in this video, let's briefly review what we've learned. We've gone through what phrasal verbs are, how to structure them, and how to change the grammatical form. We've also looked at some key rules as to whether they're transitive, intransitive, separable or inseparable, and idiomatic or literal. And we've looked at some effective ways to learn and practice phrasal verbs. If you liked this video, make sure you hit the like button, and also remember to subscribe for even more native English and business English tips, insights and lessons. And before I go, let me know in the comments what you find difficult about phrasal verbs and which of the tips or steps today has helped you the most. Feel free also to connect with me on social media. You'll find all the links you need in the description below. And last but not least, if you want to learn even more English right now, check out these two videos over here. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.